Everyone, Zach here. Today I'm going to talk about going from the URI module to building out a custom module to integrate with an external API. So this is a continuation of the movie database series, which I'll refer to as TMDB. So the previous post I talked about how you could go from just an API documentation, general API, or maybe like some scripts that you have and convert them into Ansible playbooks using the URI module. Now I'm going to go from the URI module to a custom module. So what I've got up here, as you can see, this is the playbook, the result of the previous post, where we have an Ansible playbook that's using the Ansible built-in URI module, and it's basically following the steps required to first authenticate with the movie database API. And if we scroll down here, you can see it's kind of going through the steps to get a session. And finally, we're actually going to go and interact with the API and get information from a protected resource. In this case, it's my favorite movies. So when we think about going from this to a custom module, the first thing I generally like to start with is module utils. So if I look in my structure here, this repo on the left, this is actually the structure for my custom collection that's going to contain my modules. So it's called zjleblanc.tmdb. This is a pretty standard structure. Within plugins is where your modules will live. You can also have like filter plugins, lookup plugins. In this particular case, I'm just going to have modules. So I've got two folders, one for modules, one for module utils. The modules folder is where there will be a Python module, not to get confused with an Ansible module. There will be a file per module that you create in your collection. Module utils is where you put the shared code. So let me dive into module utils because I think it's the basis of any good collection with modules. I'm going to step into this client.py. I followed an example kind of using the ServiceNow collection where they're interacting with an API and they have a ton of different modules and kind of seeing what that design looked like. So I created a client file where it's going to handle the authentication process with the TMDB API. And this is really useful because it abstracts away those like first three URI calls that you saw in the playbook. And anytime I need to interact with the API, it just handles it out of the box. And even if I'm developing new modules using the same API, I don't have to rewrite any of this code. So you'll notice here, and I don't want to get too into the weeds of the code, but you'll notice that we've got some functions here to do each of those steps, right? So first I'm going to get a request token, then I'm going to validate that token with my login, then I'll create a session. And those are all wrapped into this login function, which kind of does each one. And if successful, we can then use this client to make requests to the API. So I have all these other wrapper functions as well, where you can do the different HTTP methods against a particular endpoint in the TMDB API. So that's the first part for this post. It's pretty similar. So most any collection you use that's interacting with an API is going to have some sort of client abstracted that's going to be leveraged by all the modules. I'll quickly touch on this errors.py. I wrapped the exception class for Python just in some specific exceptions just to give myself a better idea of when things go wrong, why they went wrong, and hopefully give the user some beneficial information. So in a particular case, right, if I have a TMDB response exception, I'm going to go ahead and print out, hey, this is an unexpected response from the TMDB API. Here's the status, and here's what I got back. Just to give a clear message to, something failed and not just some random HTTP error. So let me dive into the modules. I've got two modules here. The first one is going to be favorite movies info. And then there's one called favorite movies. I did this specifically because you'll see there's a paradigm for using the _info for a resource of an API. That is generally going to be to handle GET requests to a particular resource. Ansible, as you know, is idempotent. So anytime we make changes, right, if it's already there, we don't necessarily want to make a change. _info modules typically never make a change. You're just retrieving information. And then the one below for favorite movies is where I might actually make a change. So I might add a movie to my list of favorites, or I might remove a movie from my list of favorites. So first off, favorite movies info. Scroll up to the top here, you can see a lot of red documentation. This follows the specification so that when I publish this collection up to Ansible Galaxy, it actually is able to parse it and create a UI and a nice viewable entry into the documentation for this particular module. I'm going to go ahead and skip over that, but feel free to take a look in closer detail so you can do it for your modules as well. Let's scroll down here to this main function. So the first thing, which is really important, is the argument spec. So the argument spec, if you can imagine, like when you use an Ansible module and you have, the different, like indented below the different variables you're passing in, this is defining what you can pass in. So it's going to do type. There's a required flag. So is this required or not? And then fallback is also really important. I like to use environment fallback, especially when I'm working with authorization details. So in this case, I'm falling back to these environment values if they're defined. This works really well with a custom credential, because with a custom credential, you can inject environment variables into your environment. And then when I leverage this module, I don't necessarily have to, each time I use this module, I don't have to re-pass in API key, username, password. It will just pull it from the environment. And there's a lot of cool things you can do with argument specs. So I'm just defining 3 parts of a particular argument, but you can get really fancy with, having dependencies across arguments, required if, exclude if, things like that. Then after that, I'm going to go ahead and create an instance of the base class Ansible module, which kind of gives me functions to where I can hook into the life cycle of a module, so that when Ansible runs it, I can, take advantage of the different steps. And when I do that, I'm going to pass in my argument spec. And I'm also just saying in this case, it does support check mode. So then when I scroll down, this is like the meat of the module itself, right? And it's really simple. And the nice thing is because I'm using the shared code from module utils. So I'm instantiating my client and I'm just passing through the parameters, which are going to process the environment fallback. So you'll see in the playbook when I show this and I actually call the module, I'm not going to be passing any of that information. And that's because it's going to come from the environment itself. But once the client's created, I actually call the login function. So I'm then authenticated with the client, and the client will store a token. And then I'm going to do a get, and I'm going to get from the account ID that's passed through in the list of favorite movies. I'll then process that with the JSON library, and I'll call this module exit JSON. I'm going to say changed false, right? That's really important in Ansible because I'm not making a change here. And then I'm going to give it the favorites object with the key favorites, right? So that if I registered a variable, I could say registered variable.favorites, and it would give me the response from the API. And then of course I wrap this in a try except, so that if I do get an error, I want to go ahead and use the module.fail JSON and print out that error, so that I can gracefully exit and fail this particular module. So let's go and look at the TMDB collection playbook. So this is what it looks like when you're not using URI and you're actually using a custom module, right? You don't see any of those steps to get, a request token or anything like that, because that all happens in the module code. And all I have to do when I use this module is I'm just specifying the account ID. I actually could have used an environment variable here, but I just wanted to show passing it explicitly. And then all the authentication parameters are going to come from the environment. Additionally, I have between these, you'll see I have these debugs. These are just kind of for demo purposes, but in reality, the meat of this playbook where I'm getting the favorite movies, adding Dune, and then removing Dune is really just these 3 tasks. The debugs are kind of helpers to demonstrate what it looks like. So let's also quickly dive into favorite movies. So this one's slightly different, right? Because favorite movies can make a change. I'm adding Dune in this particular case, or I'm saying state absent and I'm removing it in this case. So let's take a look at that module. Again, I'll scroll down past the documentation. We've already covered argument spec. We've covered module. You'll see here, there's a little bit more logic in this one, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start by getting the favorites, right? Because I need to know the state of the favorites before I run my add or remove function. And then I'm going to extract the state from the module params as well as the movie ID. And then I have this custom function here where I give it the movie ID and favorites and say, hey, does this movie ID exist in favorites? And then I generate a payload for the endpoint. So this is specific to TMDB. The payload for adding or removing a favorite to your list is going to be, you give it the media type for movie because it could be like a TV show as well. You give it the ID, and then you have favorite, which is true or false. So in this case, my payload is going to be based off the state. If the state's present, I want the favorite to be true. If it's false, or if it's absent, I want it to be false. Then I have kind of this if-elif where I'm going through and doing the different permutations of how this module could be used. So in this particular case, state's present and it's already a favorite. I'm just going to exit the JSON, change is false. and I'll go ahead and send back the current state of the favorites. If the state is present and it's not favorited, I'm going to go through the process of adding it to the favorite, and then I'm going to get the new favorites list, and I'll go ahead and exit. This time I'm saying change is true, which again, very important here. So I'm notifying that I did have to make a change. And then the next two branches are very similar, but just the opposite condition, right? If it's absent and not favorited, I don't need to do anything. If it's absent, it is favorited, I want to go ahead and use the payload to remove it from my list, and I will go ahead and send back the list of change favorites. And again, all wrapped in a try except to make sure that we can fail gracefully. So let's give it a shot. Let's open it up here, and we'll run it. If you did read the previous post, you'll know that in my virtual environment activation script is where I set up the environment with some of those parameters. So that's how my usage of the module itself is going to authenticate with the API. The playbooks and then TMDB collection. Let it run. All right. So pretty cool here. We've got, first off, we're just going to go ahead and get the favorites, and you'll see we've got a list of favorite movies. It starts off, it's got Oppenheimer and Fight Club. Then we add Dune to the favorites, and again, you'll notice it's changed, right? Because Dune wasn't in those lists. If I scroll down, and this next one where we debug it again, we should see Dune. Yeah, cool. So Dune is on our list of favorites. Keep going. So since we just added it, and now we're removing it, it's going to be changed, right? So we're moving Dune here, and if we go to the next debug, Dune should be no longer in the list, and it's not. So that was a good quick overview of how you can develop some custom modules and improve the readability and maintainability of your Ansible playbooks, as well as shareability, right? So, you know, if I'm a developer and understand this type of thing, anybody can consume these modules rather easily, right? Once I build out the documentation and show, hey, just set these parameters, boom, they can go interact with TMDB. And I think that's the powerful part of doing this. If I really quickly open up, if you want to see this collection in Galaxy, just search TMDB, and you'll see under my namespace is EJ LeBlanc, the TMDB collection. And as I mentioned, that documentation, right, that it's in that explicit format so that Galaxy can parse it and create really useful documentation with examples return of how these modules can be used. So thanks for watching, and please reach out if you have any questions.